Hello, and welcome to the Faith and Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 25th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of November 10th, 2024. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to get into this week's podcast, and I'm excited now we have a couple weeks here before we get into Christ the King Sunday in a couple weeks, and then that's the end of year B. And then we move into Advent, and that's just a crazy whirlwind in and of itself. And it's an amazing and fun time here as we're in that end of that growing season. There's some great things to be able to get into and some heavy, hard-hitting topics. And we've kind of been going through some of those the last few weeks, and we kind of continued. And let's just jump right into the question that we had for last week, which was, what wisdom do you think other people overlook? And I had a great response this last week talking about how we, at least here in the United States, have de-emphasized elders, and how if you look around the world, this is not something that is common. And especially when we're looking at some of the different issues and things that we're running into, we definitely need to be considerate and thinking about how does our past influence our present and future, and what can we learn from these? And I think that's one of the things that we as people struggle with in the society of trying to move faster and faster and faster, that we often overlook some of that stuff. And it's really unfortunate because there is a lot that can be learned from that. There can be a lot that is gained from that. And in doing that, it gives us vision and being able to see beyond where we're at the current moment, allowing us to actually have deeper conversations and allow us to actually make better decisions long term from that. So let's just jump into it for this week. One of the Old Testament texts that you can choose from is from Ruth chapter 3 verses 1 to 5 and chapter 4, 13 through 17. We are skipping ahead here vastly in the Ruth story. Let's just do a quick summation. So we've had Ruth, who has made the commitment that she's going to stay with Naomi, her mother-in-law, even though she has lost her spouse and has told her to leave her kids. And Ruth clings to her instead. So they are impoverished. And so she is seen then gathering the grain behind in Boaz's fields. Boaz is fairly established in the community and where they're at, has some wealth, and is telling then his grain hands to leave stuff behind for her. Naomi hears about this and realizes that there's some type of distant relative here and encourages Ruth to kind of seduce Boaz in a weird way, and that's what we kind of have here, the first 5 verses of chapter 3. I understand why we kind of stop here, but she kind of goes and spends some time with Boaz, and Boaz grows to enjoy Ruth, and so they are wed. And this is then the fulfillment of the Lord providing for both Ruth and Naomi. And is continued here at the end of the chapter, discussing how they have a child. They name him Obed, who is the father of Jesse, who is the father of David, and which we know then is the relative line that we have Jesus come from. The psalm that goes with that then is Psalm 127, all 5 verses of it. And it's this recognition that the Lord of hosts is the one who is in charge and is the one that is then passing on this heritage, this recognition that we are part of the family of God. We are part of the quiver of this, that we are gathered together and we are designed with a purpose, that we are not left out and abandoned, but this is something that God sees as precious. The other Old Testament text that you can possibly have is from 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 8 to 16. This is a moment then where Elijah is going out and about and is very hungry, and he comes to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon. And while there, he ends up running across a widow there who is gathering sticks and asks if she could bring a little water so that it may drink, and then asks for a morsel of bread. And the widow comes back with, she's baked nothing. There's barely anything left in her jars. She has a little oil and a little meal. She was gathering the sticks to prepare her last meal for her and her son so that they may die. This is a moment where Elijah to, I think, the untrained ear really sounds kind of arrogant. Do not be afraid, but first come and feed me with a little cake, and then make something for yourself and your son afterwards. And it's this recognition, again, we have to remember, of different cultures of serving others, specifically before your own. But this reassurance that Elijah is giving that the Lord will make sure that there is enough food there, that they will not die, that there will continue to be food in there until it rains, and that they're able to get more from the harvest. And that's exactly what happened. The jar was not emptied. They were able to feed both Elijah and the household for many days until the rains came. And so this recognition of how God continues to provide for people. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 146, all 10 verses of it. And so this is a recognition of praise and also recognizing how God continues to be this help for us. God is there every day. God is there to make sure that heaven is coming near to us, and that we are recognizing that the faith that is within us then is fed and nourished, that we are provided for, that God continues to open our eyes up to seeing the way that the Lord is, and recognizing that the Lord is watching over us and helping guide our steps. This is a huge recognition then in that praise that God is continuing to be there for us. The epistle text this week, or second reading, is from Hebrews chapter 9, verses 24 to 28. This is a recognition of what Christ's sacrifice actually is. It is not just purely of the blood that was poured out, and it's not necessarily this idea of having to suffer and then suffer again. This is the idea that this was a one and done deal, that Christ suffered for many instead of the recognition what had been done by high priests before. I go, I give a sacrifice, something happens, I need to go and give another sacrifice. This is taking care of that. This is being replaced in that. Christ died to be the sacrifice for all, so that no longer was this continued to be needed. This is something that was a one and done deal that be able to do not only for Christ, but more for us, that we don't have to keep going a second time, that the forgiveness of sins is for all time. The gospel text this week is out of Mark chapter 12, verses 38 to 44. So here we find Jesus in the temple with regards to the marketplace around, and he is in the synagogue with watching scribes, watching these different people putting in, and they're kind of in the back, where people are putting in their large tithes and donations to the tabernacle, to the temple, and seeing all these great things. And there's a little bit of a bragging that goes on, especially that you had the money changers and how the money was being dropped in, you could hear it. And there was large sums of money that were being put in. But here we get a poor widow comes in and puts in 2 small copper coins that are worth a penny. Jesus then turns to his disciples and says, "Truly I tell you, this poor woman has put more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." This dependence, this trust, this recognition of giving something beyond their means and recognizing that God is going to continue to provide for that, and believing in that and trusting in that. And I think that is an amazing thing in and of itself. But before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do our shameless plugs for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, or commentaries, or discussions, since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some direction, ideas, things to be thinking about and considering. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text each week, but they also have some amazing art, prayers, hymns, colors, daily devotions. This is a great resource if you haven't checked it out, and it's amazing to just have there being able to reflect on and prepare for the upcoming week, week after week. So, if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter that goes through and takes a lot of the lectionary texts week after week and being able to look at them from ecological lens or implications and urgencies to be able to talk about for the lectionary each week, but also some different ecological news and ideas to be thinking about. If you enjoy listening to me talk on these texts week after week for a half an hour, I know you're going to really enjoy this stuff. I'd highly recommend checking that out down in the show notes. What does it mean to give it all? To give it all. I think especially being in a first world country, this is a very hard concept to understand because most of us really don't get to the point where we are at wit's end, where there is nothing left fiscally. We don't get to the point where we're necessarily giving it all and everything that we do. It's hard for us to recognize and to get to that place. But there are people we can look to who have done it maybe different ways. In ways that we don't necessarily recognize, in ways that they may or may not recognize. I think this week we need to talk about Marie Curie. We have mentioned Marie Curie multiple times in this podcast, but we have never really dove deep on Marie Curie, and especially this way. Marie Curie is known for being the first woman ever to win a Nobel Prize, the first woman to ever win a Nobel Prize twice, and the first person in which she won 2 Nobel Prizes in 2 different categories. She is part of a very elite list. But in that, Marie Curie did a lot more than I think we really recognize or fully process, and I think it ties into the text really well. But we need to understand a little bit of who she is to be able to get to that place. So Marie Curie was born into Poland, which was under Russian control at the time. And during that time, her parents were lower middle class. So she got the best education that she could get. But again, they were trying to scrape to get things to get by. And in doing that, there was disease and different things that went through the household, where Marie ended up losing one of her older sisters and her mother early on in her life by age 10. At this point, she stepped aside from her faith for the rest of her life. But I would argue that her faith in that first 10 years did influence her life, and we'll see that later on. But in that, she developed this interest in knowledge. She graduated with top marks in her class, and yet, being under Russian control, women did not go to college at that point. So she enrolled with her younger sister in the Flying University in Warsaw, which was known for being under the radar of what was going on under the Russian control and moving place to place so they weren't picked up. Eventually, she got to the University of Paris and ended up quickly getting what was basically the equivalence of a master's degree in both physics and chemistry fairly quickly. While there, she met Pierre Curie, which we've talked about before. Curie ends up being her spouse, but not after a little bit of debate. Curie proposed to her when she was finishing up her degree, and she turned him down. The reason being is she wanted to go back to Poland, to Warsaw, and she wanted to be a professor there. And he was willing to go there with her. And when she went, she found that they didn't want her. So she went back to Paris and was convinced to go and get her PhD. In her PhD, Henry Becquerel had just come out with early stuff on radiation. And so she decided to look into that further, and actually using an invention that her husband had invented, she decided to study radiation further, to the point where her husband actually set aside his research because he was finding her research more interesting. And she was looking at radiation of different items, and they had found uranium already at that point. But she then started to find in pitchblende that there seemed to be some radiation of higher levels. And over the next few years, she was able to, with her husband, discover polonium and then even more radioactive of radium. And from these discoveries in 1903, she was recognized with her husband for a Nobel Prize in physics for her discoveries in radiation. Now, in her discovery, initially it was just going to be her husband and Banquille, and her husband heard word about this from one person who was on the committee who was having thoughts on whether or not she should be included, and he insisted on having her included. So yet again, where she was kind of going against the grain of the society at the time, and she continued to do that throughout her whole life. With this, her husband then got promoted to being the lead in the physics department at the University of Paris. But unfortunately, due to an accident, he ended up dying shortly after, and instead of giving a grievance package to Curie, they offered her the position in this new lab. And this was fairly substantial. She was the first ever professor in France that was female, and people lining up to be able to come to her first lecture. In 1911, then, she applied to the French Academy of Science and was rejected membership, and it was projected that it was probably due to being an immigrant and being a woman. And this is a very high society of scientific thinkers getting together to be able to be in a place and talk about these different things. Meanwhile, she ended up topping them anyways by getting a Nobel Prize in chemistry for finding polonium and radium. Now, polonium, if you haven't picked up, also was named after her native Poland, of where she had originally come from. Shortly after that, World War I broke out, and Marie wanted to do anything to possibly help the war effort that she could. She went to the bank and actually literally tried selling both her Nobels, and the bank wouldn't take them. So instead, she took the winnings from the Nobel Prizes and converted them into war bonds to be able to help with the war effort. But that wasn't enough for her. Based off of recent discoveries by William Retgum, he had discovered the X-ray. She figured out that she could make these different mobile units that they nicknamed Little Curies and be able to bring them out into the battlefield. She helped instruct 150 different people to be able to drive these out, including herself, along with her daughter, then also running these 200 different units around and helping with being able to provide x-rays and saving what they project to upwards of 1 million lives during World War I. But this wasn't without cost. By this point, from her research with radiation and understanding what x-rays were, she knew that she was putting herself at a high risk. And it did eventually catch up with her, where she got aplasmatic uremic, which means that it's a blood disease where her body in the bone marrow isn't able to produce enough white blood cells to be able to cover what is going on in her body. And it eventually ended up killing her in 1934, which was unfortunate because her daughter won the Nobel Prize in chemistry in 1935, building off of some of the research that her mother had done. Before she died, though, she was able to have the Radium/Curie Institute in both France and Warsaw, and her remains were dug up in 1995 to be brought into the Platorium, which is a famous space where they have the remains of many famous French residents. And being that her body is still radioactive, all her studies and notes and her own body is protected by thick layers of concrete. What I see with Marie Curie and what she did in her life is she realized that she had so much that she could give. Taking her knowledge, taking her understanding of what was coming out in science, figuring out ways to be able to even bring that to the battlefield, figuring out ways to be able to bring radium to the public, which was utilized in cancer research and stuff until we figured out how radioactive this stuff actually was, but is also one of the big people to helping be foundational pieces to where we are within science today, helping us understand radioactivity, helping us to build upon our understanding of x-rays, being able to help save thousands, if not 1 million lives during World War I, and putting herself in harm's way in multiple ways. That's a different type of sacrifice that I don't think many of us necessarily experience. Yes, there's many of people who serve our country in various different ways, in military forces and public service ways. But I think there's also a different level when you're not necessarily knowing that you could potentially putting yourself in harm's way in the war effort, but also knowing that your research, as you continue to go into it, is actually harmful to your body, but yet I will continue to press on, and knowing that the x-rays at the time, there wasn't the safety protocols and you just couldn't do that at that time. You needed to work on saving lives instead of saving yourself. There was a selfless nature that I felt like as I was going through this, that you could see the influence of her faith from an early age influencing on where she is at that moment. Maybe she wasn't recognizing it at the time, but I would say it was definitely still seemed to be influencing at least some of her decision making in a positive way for humanitarian sake at that moment. We think about, though, with all this, that Curie could have easily died on the battlefront. She could have died like her husband through a carriage accident, and she was being exposed to radiation throughout her life that she could have easily died earlier. And yet we get where she lived 66 years, which isn't a tremendous amount, but when you think about the amount of radiation that she was exposed to, it's pretty incredible. It's almost as if God continued to be there and provide throughout her life as best that God could. There's a trust in recognizing that there's something greater than what I am living in. And I think this is one of the things that we can pick up from this widow here. This widow is putting trust in her faith at that moment, giving everything that she has, realizing that there's probably still others who will take pity on her and help her along the way, hopefully, but also recognizing that she's still putting trust in God in all of that. That it's not necessarily her giving out of abundance, but her giving at a level that could put her in harm's way. We recognize that Jesus' sacrifice in Hebrews was something to be done for all of us, and we recognize that Jesus was put in harm's way. And I think the Old Testament texts here really help us to utilize and get an image of God, especially in the Old Testament, of a God who does love and does care so much that God continues to provide. God continues to be there. God continues to help. Marie Curie gave until she literally couldn't give anymore. She gave out of the goodness of her heart to continue to understand this knowledge and realizing that this is a gift for humanity. When radium was discovered with her husband, she easily could have patented the idea. She is quoted on stating something along the lines of, "It's a natural process and this is something then that should be given to all humans. This is not something that I should be holding on to." And I think that's something for us to be thinking about. The widow gives up things that she is holding, recognizing that they're a blessing from God. And Jesus is drawing out the stark contrast between the Pharisees giving out of their abundance and this widow recognizing that there is something to give until there is nothing more to give. I think that's one thing we need to continue to work on as a society and as a world. We need to be willing and able to recognize the gifts that God is giving us all around us. The Psalms help us to see that God is willing, if we turn our eyes to God, to open our eyes to seeing more of what God is doing, to recognize the help, to recognize the gifts, to recognize the things that we should be giving thanks to. Do we spend that time to get to that place? Because if we don't get to that place, I think it really gets hard for us to ever get to the place like this widow or like Marie Curie gets to. And when we're trying to emulate what Christ did for us, it's easy to argue that we need to be able to get to that place. We need to be able to get to a place of not only being thankful for what we have been given, but being able to give more than what's comfortable as necessary. This is a hard concept for us to wrap our heads around, especially in a developed nation as the United States, as where I am producing this. We're used to giving out of abundance, not giving till it hurts necessarily. And I'm not necessarily saying that that's what we always are called to do. I think there's times where it's recognizing the gifts that we have been given as well. I would argue Marie Curie understood that she had been given a gift to be able to understand and be able to explain and shed light on radiation, and that was the atom breaking down, which was a huge breakthrough for our understanding of modern physics. Being able to discover 2 whole new elements that were able to help us understand at a deeper level more and more about radiation. Her taking that understanding and being able to take that knowledge then of her reading papers about X-rays and figuring out ways to bring it to the battlefield, to save lives while putting her own at risk. She realized that there was a time and a place, and that was the time and the place to do it. I think this is something for us to contemplate, to consider. Recognizing the gifts around us, recognizing what things is God calling us to do. What things can we learn from these experiences? One of the things I'll talk about here in about a little under 2 months, we're approaching the 7-year anniversary of the podcast, 7 full years. And there are times that I do question and wonder myself, well, why do I keep doing this? There's definitely other things that I could do. But there's a joy that I get from this. There's a joy in understanding and meeting with God here week after week as I go through these texts with God and we talk about it and we figure out how science works together in this. And there's a moment where for me, I understand that there's a gift here that God has given me, at least for this time and for this place, to do this. And so that's why I do it. There's lots of sacrifices that I do and things that I wouldn't necessarily recommend others to go through that I do for this. But I see it as something that is a gift that's way beyond me. That I see what God does with this on the back end, and we'll talk about that at the end of December. That just blows me away every time. When I realize that this isn't just about me anymore then. It's a gift that God has given me to be able to do this, to share this. And hopefully someone on the other end of this gets something from this. And I realize at that moment that this is something that is beyond just a gift that is given once. It's a gift that's given twice. A gift to me and a gift to whoever it benefits on the other end. And I realize that that's the system that God works in. It's a gift, and recognizing those gifts and utilizing those gifts and trusting that God will continue to provide is a big part of those gifts. So the question I have for you this week is, where is your gift to give until you have nothing left? Where is your gift that you have been given to give until there is nothing left? And I'm not saying that there is one gift. I know for me, this is one of many gifts that God has given. And so that I just try giving them all back as best as I can. And I know I fall short. We all fall short, but we all need to spend time to recognize this. What could our world look like when we actually start recognizing the gifts and embracing those gifts and building up each other in those gifts? We wouldn't be tearing each other down. We'd be looking for ways to continue to give and give and give and see that it's worth a life. It's a life worth living to give until we can't give anymore. So Marie Curie may not have recognized her faith at the end of her life, but I would say there were faithful elements there that we can learn from. That there are times that we are called to give beyond what we are necessarily comfortable with. And that give might not just be monetarily. That give might be in other ways. It might be in ways that don't make fiscal sense. It might be in ways that people look at you funny and say, why do you do that? But we have to recognize that we run and work with a God who doesn't necessarily work on the same values that the world runs on. God is looking at the heart. God is looking at giving and trusting, being all in. That can all be in different ways. It could be that you continue to give and put yourself in harm's way in multiple ways. Or it could be giving until you can't give anymore. Or trusting that God's going to help you through poverty and being, how are you going to provide food for me and Naomi? Or Elijah going out and where am I going to get fed, God? I haven't eaten in days. We recognize that we have a God who has done and paid the sacrifice for us. That thus we just have to lean in and trust. So what's your gift? And how are you going to use it? And I think that's where the world gets to be the best it can possibly be. Is when we do that. And I think we all have a little bit where we can learn in that. So we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.